Principal Richard Vale reached across the serving line and grabbed Noah's lunch tray. "Take it back." Two school board members were standing behind him. Richard had been giving them a tour that morning, and when they walked into the cafeteria, he was still talking about how our school made sure every dollar went where it was truly needed. Noah didn't argue. He just pulled his hands out from under the tray. I'd seen that movement before. Once some kids have been turned away, they don't ask a second time. The register showed a zero balance. On the tray was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a carton of milk, and an apple. 10 minutes earlier, Noah had asked if he could leave the milk unopened and save it until after school. "Why?" I'd asked. He stared down at the tray. "For tonight." I didn't ask anything else. Richard tapped the edge of the tray with one finger. "Elena," I said, "take it back." I scanned Noah's card again. It still wouldn't go through. His meal assistance application had already been turned in, but his account only said pending. The temporary meal section was blank. Before that semester, when something like this happened, we used the open tray fund to cover the meal. The paperwork could be fixed later. The child didn't have to stand in front of a line of classmates while adults figured out whose desk the form was sitting on. But since the beginning of the school year, the fund had stopped working. I tried to charge Noah's lunch to it. The screen kicked me back. I tried once more and got the same result. "Stop," Richard said. A few weeks earlier, he had ordered us to give any student with a zero balance a substitute meal, a cold cheese sandwich, and a carton of milk. I'd already received 2 written warnings for giving hot meals to children whose accounts were still being reviewed. "There are students waiting," he said quietly. "Don't make me deal with you in front of the board." The line had stopped moving. More than 20 children stood behind Noah holding empty trays. No one complained. Most of them were trying not to look at him. I opened the manual approval screen and released the meal under my own employee login. A notice appeared saying the decision would be recorded under my name. I clicked confirm. Then I took the small black notebook from my apron pocket and wrote down the date, the lunch period, and a short note, "Application pending. Fund did not pay." I signed my name beneath it. Then I pushed the tray back toward Noah. "Go sit down before it gets cold." Richard watched me for a moment. He didn't touch Noah's tray again. Instead, he stepped behind the serving line and tore the name badge from my chest. "Take off the apron," he said. "You're fired." My name is Elena Morales. I had worked in the cafeteria at Westbrook Elementary for 14 years. I knew which children couldn't be near peanuts, which class always left a dozen extra cartons of milk on Fridays, and which students ate especially fast on Mondays. But on the termination letter, those 14 years were reduced to one sentence: unauthorized use of school property. A school security officer waited by the kitchen door while I gathered my things. I wasn't allowed to touch the register or go back into the storeroom to finish the day's inventory. The human resources representative handed me a white envelope and told me my health insurance would continue through the end of the month. Whether my retirement credit would be protected depended on the investigation. I was 21 months away from full retirement benefits. I took the envelope. The first thing I thought about was the cost of my medication next month. Then I thought about Noah. He was still standing beside the serving line, afraid to touch the food. I looked back from the doorway. "Eat." Only then did he pick up the tray. The HR representative took me to the office and asked me to acknowledge the termination papers. The first 2 pages described what had happened that day. The 3rd page was a list. It contained 31 entries. Over the previous 6 weeks, I had released 31 hot meals that the system hadn't authorized. Each entry had a date, a time, and my name. "Did you make all of these transactions?" the HR representative asked. I read the last line and set the paper back on the desk. "Yes." She reminded me that I could speak to an employee representative first. I told her I didn't need to. I had served those meals. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't. Richard had been standing at the other end of the office. That was when he finally spoke. "So this wasn't one bad decision," he said. 6 weeks. 31 times. How is anyone supposed to run a cafeteria if every employee does whatever she wants? If you looked only at that list, his argument didn't sound unreasonable. The problem was that every time I'd released a meal, I'd entered an explanation. The student's application was pending. The open tray fund had failed to cover the charge. On the printed report, every one of those explanations was gone. My name was still there, which made it look as though I'd simply handed out school food whenever I felt like it. I didn't argue with Richard in the office. My hand was still in my apron pocket, touching the edge of my notebook. Our cafeteria computers weren't exactly dependable. The register froze. The scanner acted up when moisture got into it. For years, I'd kept a paper record as a backup. I never wrote down a child's full name. I recorded the date, grade, number of meals, and what had happened. All 31 meals were in that notebook. After I left the school, I sat in my car and went through the entries again. The students were in different grades. Some were waiting for meal assistance to be approved. Others had disputes on their accounts. Under the school's old policy, every one of those meals should have been temporarily covered by the open tray fund. The Parent-Teacher Association had started that fund 2 years earlier. When families paid activity fees, they could add $5, $25, or any amount they wanted. The donation page made the purpose simple. A child should never miss lunch because adults were still sorting out paperwork. I knew Rachel Kim, the parent volunteer who helped reconcile the donations, so I called her. "Elena," she said as soon as she answered. "Did they really fire you?" "They did. But I need to ask you something else first. Did the Open Tray Fund receive donations this semester?" "Of course it did." "How much?" "I don't have the district ledger." "It had to be tens of thousands." "Why?" I told her that in 6 weeks, the cafeteria hadn't been able to pay for a single meal from that fund. Rachel didn't immediately take my side. She asked if I had screenshots of the accounts, a student list, or financial records. "No," I said. "I have the dates of 31 meals, and I know those children were waiting for assistance. That proves the cafeteria couldn't access the money. It doesn't prove the money is gone." "I know. Can you check the parents' receipts?" "Just confirm the school received the donations and didn't refund them." A public budget meeting was already scheduled for the following morning. Richard had been preparing for it all week. He was supposed to explain the school's spending for the new semester. Rachel thought for a moment, then asked me to send whatever records I could legally share. I covered anything that might identify a child and left only the dates, grades, meal counts, and the words application pending. By early evening, she had found 12 receipts. A few hours later, more than 100 families had agreed to verify their payments. Close to midnight, she called me again. "Are you coming to the meeting tomorrow?" "I'm not an employee anymore. It's a public meeting. You can attend." I asked how many people she'd contacted. "I'm still counting," she said. "But they're not coming to chant your name. They want the school to explain where their money went." The next morning, I returned to Westbrook wearing a plain gray blouse. My folded termination letter sat on top of a clear folder with the black notebook underneath it. Richard was waiting at the cafeteria entrance. He looked at me, then at the folder. "You can't enter an employee area. I'm here for the budget meeting. You were terminated. That's why I'm not wearing an apron, and I'm not going into the kitchen." He asked whether the notebook was school property. I told him every child's information had been covered, the notebook belonged to me, and the signatures in it were mine. He was about to call HR when the double doors behind him opened. Rachel walked in carrying a stack of receipts with blue borders. Behind her was a nurse who had just finished a night shift and still had her hospital badge clipped to her uniform. She had donated $25. The owner of a nearby auto shop had donated $500. A grandfather who had been giving $15 every month for 2 years came in holding his granddaughter's hand. More people kept coming. No signs. No shouting. Each person signed in at the entrance and showed a receipt to Rachel. The folding chairs filled first. Then people stood along the back wall. When there was no more room, the line stretched into the hallway. The front office brought out a second sign-in table. By the time the 200th parent wrote down a name, the meeting was already 19 minutes late. Richard stood beside the doorway for a while. Then he leaned toward the HR representative and said something I couldn't hear. 5 minutes before the meeting began, she asked me to step into a small office next door. A new document was waiting on the table. Richard closed the door and slid it toward me. He said the whole situation could still be treated as a management communication error. If I signed, my termination would be withdrawn. My health insurance would continue, and my retirement credit would remain intact. I stared at those lines for a long time. They answered every question I had been afraid to think about since the day before. Then I turned the page and found the confidentiality agreement. I would have to hand over my paper records, admit that I had misunderstood the purpose of the fund, and agree never to discuss the 31 meals in public. The next time a child is stuck waiting for approval, I asked, can the cafeteria give that child a hot meal? We're going to retrain the appropriate staff. That's not what I asked. Can we feed the child first? Richard didn't answer. He only reminded me that I was 21 months away from full retirement benefits and that 31 unauthorized meals could permanently disqualify me. The pen was lying beside my right hand. I touched it. Then I read the confidentiality agreement one more time, closed the document, and pushed it back. I'm not signing it. You need to think very carefully. I have. I carried my folder back into the cafeteria. Richard didn't stop me. He only told the HR representative to put the agreement away. When the meeting began, he didn't start by explaining where the donations had gone. He put my 31 meal transactions on the projector screen. Before anyone reaches a conclusion, we need to establish the facts, he said, pointing to the list. Ms. Morales was not terminated because of one lunch. Over 6 weeks, she bypassed the school's financial controls 31 times and distributed food without authorization. People at the back of the room began talking quietly. Richard said the school cared about children as much as anyone did. But if an employee could use personal judgment to distribute food, then donations, budgets, and student safety couldn't be properly managed. Finally, he turned toward me. Do you deny these transactions? I stood. No. The room got louder. The list was real, and there was no answer I could give that would make it look good. Yes, I served 31 unauthorized lunches. I looked at Richard, then at the receipts in the parents' hands. Now show these parents why their money couldn't pay for even one of them. This time, no one spoke. Rachel rose from her seat and placed the first receipt into a clear document box beside the podium. $25, paid on September 2nd. The next receipt was for $100. Then $500. The parents came forward in sign-in order. Rachel and another volunteer verified each payment and added it to a spreadsheet. The total passed $10,000 while half the room was still waiting. When they finished, the verified donations came to more than $34,000. Not one had been refunded. The donation page said the money would provide regular hot meals to students while their eligibility was under review or their accounts were being resolved. Rachel placed the receipt dates beside the meal dates from my notebook. I had served the first of those 31 meals 3 days after the first donation reached the school. For the next 6 weeks, the fund hadn't paid for a single child. Richard waited until she was finished. Then he took out another document. The fund is not missing. He put a set of school board minutes on the screen. He said the number of families asking for assistance had increased, so the board had approved using the money for weekend nutrition packs instead. According to him, that program helped whole families, not just a child eating one lunch at school. Then 3 invoices appeared on the screen. They came from a company called BrightPath Family Outreach. Each invoice had an official stamp and approval signatures. The 2 board members in the front row had both signed them. One said he remembered voting to expand weekend support, but hadn't realized the open tray fund would be used. Richard immediately reminded him that the meeting minutes were clear. Parents who had been watching the donation total started reading the fine print on their receipts. Someone asked whether this was really a financial problem if the money had purchased food and only the purpose had changed. For the first time since the meeting began, Richard stepped away from the podium and returned to his chair. I understand why people are upset when they see one child without lunch, he said. But a school can't make decisions based on one image. Weekend nutrition packs allow us to help more families. I didn't understand the transfer categories on those documents. I didn't know what the board members' signatures meant legally. But I understood the food descriptions, the quantities, and the delivery dates. The September 14th invoice stopped me. That weekend, The walk-in cooler had been shut down for maintenance. 2 other cafeteria workers and I had moved every item of food to the district warehouse on Friday afternoon. The kitchen couldn't accept refrigerated deliveries all weekend. I checked the other invoices. All 3 deliveries were listed on Saturdays. Each one claimed that more than 1,000 refrigerated nutrition packs had been delivered to the Westbrook Elementary kitchen. Which door did they use? I asked. Richard looked confused. I pointed to the school address on the invoice. It says the food was delivered to our kitchen. No one works here on Saturdays. Which door did the truck use? That's a vendor operations detail. Every food delivery has to be signed for. Refrigerated food needs a temperature record. I opened my receiving log. The kitchen had been closed on September 7th. The cooler was under maintenance on September 14th. On September 21st, the rear door alarm system was being upgraded, and badge access had been shut off for the entire day. I didn't sign a single delivery slip on any of those dates. Richard cut me off. He said I was no longer an employee and had no right to display internal school records at a public meeting. Then don't use my notebook, I said. Check your own door records and cooler logs. The auditor seated beside the board had been taking notes throughout the budget discussion. He asked to see the delivery signatures on the back of the invoices. Richard said the vendor could provide them after the meeting. What about transportation temperature records? The auditor asked. No one answered. And a record of how many families received the packs? Richard said that information involved family privacy and couldn't be made public. The auditor nodded. He said the names could remain private, but the school still needed distribution totals and confirmation from a staff member who had accepted the deliveries. Richard closed the folder in front of him. Enough. Ms. Morales was terminated. She has no standing to keep disrupting this meeting. He ordered the school security officer by the wall to remove me and my documents. As the officer came toward me, I held the notebook against my chest. I didn't have bank statements. I couldn't prove where the money had ended up. At that point, I could prove only one thing. The invoices claimed food had reached my kitchen, and I had never seen it. The officer stopped in front of me. Hold on, the board chair said. She asked the auditor whether the 3 dates could be checked immediately. District finance and technology staff were already present for the budget meeting, so they pulled up the rear door access history and the cooler records. On September 7th, no vendor entered the school. On September 14th, the cooler was offline for maintenance. On September 21st, the rear door remained locked all day. Not one of the 3 invoices had been signed by a school employee. The auditor didn't accuse anyone of stealing. He said only that the available records could not establish that the nutrition packs had ever been delivered. The district needed to preserve the financial records, emails, and door history immediately, and no remaining payments should be released. Richard objected that the auditor didn't have the authority to make that decision during a meeting. The board chair looked at him. He isn't making the decision. We are. Enough board members were present to hold a vote. Within minutes, the remaining Bright Path payments were frozen and all related records were ordered preserved. Until an independent investigation was complete, Richard was suspended as principal and stripped of his financial approval authority and campus access. This violates procedure, Richard said from beside the podium. You can't do this based on one cafeteria worker's private notes. The board chair didn't let him finish. Mr. Vale, hand over your access card. The security officer who had been walking toward me turned and approached Richard instead. The day before, Richard had ripped the name badge from my chest. Now he lowered his head, unclipped his own lanyard, and placed his access card in the officer's hand. To leave the podium, he had to pass the clear box filled with receipts. Several parents were still waiting to submit theirs. They moved aside just enough to let him through, then continued placing the receipts into the box. No one applauded. The cafeteria was filled with the sound of paper sliding against paper and Richard's footsteps crossing the floor. I didn't return to the kitchen the next day. The district still had to investigate all 31 meals. At the end of the month, my health insurance really did stop. I went 6 weeks without a paycheck, and I had no idea whether I would lose 14 years of retirement credit. The investigators placed every transaction in front of me, one at a time. I admitted to each one. Someone asked whether I would do it again. I didn't answer right away. If a hungry child were already standing in front of me and the food was already on the tray, I probably would, I said. But you shouldn't force the next cafeteria worker to make that choice. The independent audit lasted 5 weeks. Investigators recovered the explanations that had been cleared from the meal accounts. All 31 had originally said the same thing: application pending. Fund did not pay. The auditor later told me that 3 days before the public budget meeting, Richard already knew parents planned to ask about the open tray fund. He had instructed the technology staff to remove the cafeteria's explanations and leave only the records showing that an employee had released meals without authorization. HR had also received drafts of my termination paperwork before the meeting. BrightPath Family Outreach never produced valid delivery slips, transportation temperature records, or confirmation from families who had received the nutrition packs. Corporate registration documents also showed an undisclosed family connection between Richard and the person who controlled the company. The board members who signed the approvals were investigated as well. One resigned from the finance committee. Richard was formally removed as principal, the vendor contract was terminated, and the evidence was referred for further investigation. In the 6th week, the district sent me its decision. The report didn't pretend I had done nothing wrong. It said plainly that I had violated meal service procedures 31 times. But the open tray fund had been created to feed children while their applications were pending. Management had redirected the money and removed the account explanations, leaving the cafeteria unable to use the fund for its stated purpose. My termination was erased from my record. The district paid all 6 weeks of back wages, restored my health coverage retroactively, and protected every year of my retirement credit. The board asked me to return. They also offered me the position of cafeteria manager. I accepted. I needed the job, and I wasn't going to pretend the title and the paycheck didn't matter. But I gave them 2 conditions. If a student's assistance or account was under review, the cafeteria would serve a regular hot meal first and let the adults fix the paperwork afterward. And the open tray fund would be reconciled jointly by cafeteria staff, a parent representative, and district finance, with the balance available for families to see. The board agreed. On my first Monday back, the lunch system was running slowly. Noah came to my register carrying roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a carton of milk, and an apple. When I scanned his card, the screen flashed red. His hands immediately slipped out from under the tray, exactly as they had 6 weeks earlier. A few seconds later, the red warning disappeared. Green letters appeared on the screen. Meal approved. Noah still didn't move. I pushed the tray back toward him. Sit down before it gets cold. He picked up the tray and walked toward the table in the corner. This time, no adult reached out to take it away.